The rehearsal began at 7. Iris Calloway knew this because she had written the schedule herself 3 months earlier when the Lincoln Center Commission had first been confirmed, and Sebastian had handed her the logistics folder with the particular elegance of a man who understood that the organizational infrastructure of his career was not something he needed to concern himself with personally. She had built the rehearsal timeline around the complexity of the piece, the string transitions in the second movement, the percussion entry in the third, the long sustained passage for solo violin at the center of the fourth, that she had written in the apartment on West 82nd Street at 2 in the morning while Sebastian slept. That passage was currently being played by the Chicago Symphony's concertmaster. Under Sebastian Crane's baton, Iris sat in the third row of the rehearsal hall, a high-ceilinged room beneath the main stage at Lincoln Center with the particular acoustic quality of a space designed to contain sound but not to flatter it, and listened to her music conducted by her husband, and she thought this is the last time. She had thought some version of this before, but this time was different. This time she had a reason that was specific and provable, and that she had been carrying for 36 hours like a stone in her chest. She had found it on a Tuesday morning the way she found most things she wasn't supposed to find by being in the wrong room at the wrong moment. Sebastian had left his laptop open on the kitchen table when he went to take a call from the Lincoln Center programming director, and Iris had walked through carrying coffee, and the document on the screen had been titled Crane World Premiere Program Notes. Final draft, and she had stopped because program notes were in her domain. She wrote them. She had written them for every premiere in 12 years, and she had not written these. She set down the coffee. She read. The program notes described the composition of Meridian, the 40-minute orchestral work that was to premiere at Lincoln Center in 72 hours in language that was smooth and confident and almost entirely accurate and attributed entirely to Sebastian, his creative vision, his compositional process, the months of solitary work. The specific musical choices, the use of a Lydian mode in the third movement, the deliberate asymmetry of the percussion rhythms, the long violin solo that he described as the emotional center of the piece, the moment where solitude and connection become the same thing. She had written that sentence. She had written it at 2 in the morning in a notebook she kept by the bed, the kind of sentence that arrived complete when you weren't trying to write it, and that you wrote down quickly before it dissolved. She had written it describing the violin solo she was composing, the solo that was now in the printed score and the performance parts distributed to 62 musicians in the program notes on Sebastian's screen attributed to his creative vision. Iris stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then she picked up her coffee and went to the practice room and closed the door. The practice room was the smaller of the two rooms they kept for music in the apartment. A converted second bedroom with acoustic panels on the walls and a window that looked onto the back of another building and a stand in the corner where she kept her violin. It was her room. Sebastian had his studio, a larger space at the front of the apartment with the Yamaha grand piano he used for compositional work and recording equipment and the framed photographs from his major performances. Carnegie Hall at 31, the Berlin Philharmonic at 34, the Salzburg Festival at 37. The practice room had no photographs. It had sheet music in folders on shelves, a metronome she rarely used because tempo was internal, a small desk where she kept notebooks. 3 shelves of notebooks going back to graduate school, the raw material of 20 years of compositional work. None of it published, all of it eventually absorbed into the work that bore Sebastian's name. She stood in the center of the practice room and thought about the program notes. She had known for a long time that the arrangements she and Sebastian had fallen into over the course of their marriage were not strictly conventional. She had understood this and accommodated it, and found for many years reasons why the accommodation was reasonable. She was a violinist, not a composer by training. She had composed as a private practice, as the extension of her musical thinking, not as a professional aspiration. Sebastian was a conductor, a public figure with the infrastructure of a career that required consistent creative output. She had helped him. She had helped him the way partners helped each other, the way the person who was better at something contributed that thing to the shared enterprise. She had told herself this story for 12 years. The program notes were a specific kind of evidence that the story was not quite true. Meridian was hers. Not in the collaborative sense, not the sense in which she might reasonably say she had contributed significantly. She had composed it. She had written every note in the notebooks on the shelves and in the score files on her laptop over 9 months, while Sebastian had been in Prague for a residency in Vienna for a guest conducting engagement and Tokyo for a festival. He had been away for more of the composition period than he had been present. He had seen the score and stages, had offered occasional structural comments that she had incorporated or not. As she chose, had attended 3 of the 4 orchestral reading sessions she'd organized. He had never held a pencil over a blank score page and written a note that was in the final work. She stood in the practice room and understood finally and completely the thing she had been half understanding for years. She had not been helping Sebastian. She had been providing him with work. There was a difference, and the difference was the program notes. Iman said. She had not confronted him. That was the first decision made in the practice room on Tuesday morning, and she had not wavered from it in the 36 hours since. She had thought about it carefully, the confrontation, what it would produce, what Sebastian would say. She knew what he would say. She had known Sebastian for 15 years. He would say, "We've always worked this way. We've always been collaborative. You know, the music is as much yours as mine." He would say it with the particular warmth and ease of a man who had never been required to examine the distinction between collaboration and extraction. He would say it, and he would mean it in the specific way that people meant things, when meaning it was the same as not having to change. She had not confronted him because confrontation would not give her what she needed. What she needed was something else. Something she had been turning over in her mind for 36 hours. Something that was either the clearest thing she had ever thought or the most reckless. She needed the music to be hers. Not eventually, not through the slow process of legal claims and industry conversations and the careful reconstruction of a record. She needed it in the next 72 hours before the Lincoln Center premiere, before Meridian entered the public record as Sebastian Crane's work. She needed to perform it first, under her own name. The rehearsal continued. The third movement, which was the most technically complex, the percussion asymmetry, she designed to create a kind of metric instability that resolved gradually and with effort into the certainty of the fourth movement, was giving the orchestra difficulty in the way she had known it would. She had written it to be difficult. The difficulty was structural. It was supposed to feel for the musicians performing it like the experience of working through something genuinely hard towards something worth reaching. Sebastian stopped the orchestra at bar 47. "The entry here," he said in the voice he used with orchestras, which was different from the voice he used everywhere else, measured precise, with the authority of someone who had been in front of orchestras for 20 years. "We're losing the displacement. The point of these bars is the ground shifting under you. If you find it too early, it's just syncopation. I need you to stay lost longer." Iris watched the musicians. Most of them had worked with Sebastian before the Chicago Symphony was a repeat engagement, his third with them, in 4 years. They responded to him well. He had a talent for orchestral communication that was genuine, whatever else she understood about his relationship to the music. He knew how to get what he wanted from players. He didn't know quite what the third movement was supposed to feel like from the inside. She had never told him because she had always assumed that was not information he needed, that the score itself communicated what was necessary. She understood now that she had assumed this because it was the assumption that sustained the arrangement. The orchestra tried the passage again. It was better. Not right yet, but better. Bar 47. She had written bar 47 in the apartment on an afternoon in November when Sebastian was in Vienna, and the apartment was quiet, and she had been working for 6 hours and was tired in the specific satisfied way that came from sustained focused effort on something real. She had been in this practice room at this desk in this apartment, writing bars 41 through 53, and she had been alone and the music had come from her. She watched Sebastian stop the orchestra again. She watched him describe what he wanted, the staying lost, the displacement, the earned resolution. He was describing her intentions accurately. He had read the score well enough to understand what she had put there. That was his talent, reading and executing and communicating. Those were genuine skills. They were not composition. She sat in the third row of the rehearsal hall with her hands in her lap and thought about 72 hours. She thought about a performance space in Brooklyn she had been to, twice a venue called The Loft at Atlantic Terminal capacity 200 with a Steinway and a stage that was modest and clean and acoustically better than its size suggested. She had performed there once 3 years ago, a solo recital for which she had been the opening act for a rising young pianist, and she had thought then that it was the right size for certain kinds of music, intimate enough that you could hear the breathing, large enough for the music to expand. She thought about 8 musicians she knew personally, people she had worked with over 20 years, colleagues who knew her playing and trusted her judgment, and who she believed if she called them tonight would say yes to something they didn't fully understand yet, because they understood enough about her. She thought about the score of meridians saved on her laptop under a file name that was hers alone in a folder she had created with a creation date she could document and a version history that went back 9 months. She thought about 72 hours. It was not enough time for most things. For a woman who had been composing for 20 years, who knew every bar of this music from the inside, who had 8 musicians she could call tonight, 72 hours was exactly enough. The rehearsal broke at 9:30. Sebastian emerged from the podium with the slightly elevated quality he always had after a good rehearsal. Not ebullient, not loud, but lighter. More present. Music did that for him genuinely. She had always given him that. "Good session, sir," he said, finding her in the 3rd row. He sat beside her with the automatic ease of 12 years. "The 3rd movement is coming. They'll have it by tomorrow." "The entry at bar 47, she said. "If you have them think of it as a question rather than a statement, the meter as a question, the displacement comes more naturally." He looked at her. Then he wrote it in his score notes with a small silver pencil. He always wrote her notes in a small silver pencil and transferred the good ones to his conducting scores, and never said where they had come from, which was simply how things worked between them, which she was going to end. "What time is the dress rehearsal?" he asked. 2 o'clock tomorrow, she said. "You have a program interview with the Times at 11. "The program notes, did you look at the draft?" She looked at him. She held his gaze for exactly the time it took to make a decision she had already made. "They're fine," she said. He nodded, satisfied. He looked back at his score. He was already in the music, which was where he lived, which was true of both of them, which was the thing they had in common before everything else. She stood up. "I'm going to the practice room," she said. "I have some things to work through tonight." "I'll be up late," he said, not looking up. "Don't wait for dinner." She picked up her bag. She walked out of the rehearsal hall and through the backstage corridor and out onto Columbus Avenue, where the October night was cold and clear, and the city was doing its usual indifferent, brilliant thing, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the air on her face. 72 hours. She took out her phone. She called a cellist named James Ford, who had been her colleague at the Chicago Symphony for 6 years, and who was in New York this week for a chamber music engagement. He answered on the 2nd ring. "Iris," he said, "what's going on?" "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to say yes before I explain." A pause. The specific pause of someone who has known you long enough to understand what a request like that means. "All right," James said. "Yes." She exhaled. "Good," she said. "I'll explain everything. Can you meet me tonight?" "Where She named a coffee shop 2 blocks from Lincoln Center. She said 11 p.m. "I'll be there," he said. She put her phone in her pocket. She had 1 call down, 7 more to make. She started walking. But the coffee shop was called Allegro, which was either a coincidence or not, depending on how you felt about the city arranging its small ironies, and it was open until midnight, which was useful. Iris arrived first and took a corner table and ordered tea, and sat with her phone and her notebook and the specific quality of someone who is very calm about something very large. By 11:15, she had made all 8 calls. The results in order: James Ford, yes, immediately, without qualification, which was what she had expected from James. Maya Torres, violist, currently in New York for a recording session. Yes, after 30 seconds of silence, which was Maya processing the request and deciding it was legitimate. Peter Wu, 2nd violin, a former colleague from the symphony, who now freelanced and whose schedule she knew was open this week. Yes, slightly confused, but trusting. Celia Burke, violin, a graduate school friend who had not played with Iris in 3 years, but who had heard Meridian at one of the reading sessions Iris had arranged and had said afterward quietly, "I don't know how he does it," meaning Sebastian and Iris had said nothing, and Celia had looked at her with the particular attention of someone who had just noticed something, yes, immediately, with a quality in her voice that suggested she had been waiting for this call. Daniel Marsh. This was the one she had hesitated over. Daniel was a music critic. She had met him twice, both times at post-concert events, and both times had found him to be one of the rare critics who asked compositional questions rather than performance ones, who was interested in the music as a made thing rather than an event to be assessed. He wrote for a music publication and occasionally for the Times. He was 38, roughly her age, with the specific intellectual restlessness of someone who was always looking for the thing underneath the thing. She had not called him to ask him to perform. She had called him to ask him to listen. He answered on the fourth ring, slightly surprised to hear from her they were acquaintances, not friends. Their relationship constituted of 3 conversations over 2 years. She told him only that she was organizing an informal performance at a Brooklyn venue in 72 hours and that it was something he would not want to have missed. She did not say what she was performing or why the timing mattered. He said, "You're being deliberately cryptic." "Yes," she said. A pause. "I'll be there," he said. "Bring your recorder," she said, "but don't publish anything until I tell you it's all right." That's an unusual request. "I know. Will you agree to it?" Another pause. "Yes," he said. Remaining calls a percussionist named Sophia Reeves, who she had worked with at a chamber concert 3 years earlier, and who had a particular gift for the kind of rhythmic complexity that the third movement required, and an oboist named Marcus Webb, who had been in 3 of the reading sessions, and who knew the score almost as well as anyone outside the core ensemble. Sophia, yes, slightly breathless with what sounded like excitement she was trying to contain. Marcus Webb. Yes, then. "This is about Meridian, isn't it?" She paused. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've heard you talk about this piece," he said. "I've watched you in those reading sessions, and I've watched Sebastian at those reading sessions." A pause. "Yes, I'll be there." 8 calls, 8 yeses. James arrived at the coffee shop at 11:20. He was a tall man, mid-40s, with the composed physical economy of a musician who had spent 20 years managing a cello in transit. He sat down, ordered coffee, and looked at her. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Not everything. She did not yet know how much everything there was, but the essential facts, the program notes, the score history, the 9 months of composition, the 72 hours. James listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Specifically." 4 hours of rehearsal," she said. "Tomorrow evening starting at 6. The venue is booked for 11 p.m. I called while I was walking here. The performance is 2 hours with an intermission. I need the third movement to work with 7 musicians instead of 62. I've been working on the reduction for the last 3 hours in my head." She opened her notebook. The reduction was there, penciled, quick but complete in its essential structure. James looked at it. He was one of the musicians she trusted most in the world. His ear, his judgment, his ability to hold complex musical structure in his head and translate it quickly. He looked at the reduction for perhaps 90 seconds. "This works," he said. "I know," she said. The third movement transition. "I adjusted the percussion to compensate. Sophia can handle it." "And the violin solo in the fourth." "That's mine," she said. "That was always mine." James looked at her for a long moment. She had known James Ford for 18 years. He had been at their wedding. He had played at the wedding, actually a Brahms intermezzo that she had chosen, and that Sebastian had stood at the altar listening to with the particular expression of a man who understood he was in the presence of something beautiful without quite understanding why. "I want to ask you something," James said. "Go ahead." "Is this the first piece?" She understood the question. She answered it honestly. "No," she said. He nodded. He set his coffee down. He picked up the notebook and looked at the reduction again. 6 o'clock tomorrow," he said. "Where?" She named a rehearsal space in Midtown she had used before, where she had a standing relationship and could book on short notice. She had already texted them. They had confirmed availability. "I'll tell the others," she said. "You don't need to coordinate. I'll handle it." "What can I do tonight?" Go home, she said. Sleep. I need you sharp tomorrow. He stood. He put on his coat. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has just understood the full weight of something. Iris, he said. I know, she said. It's the right thing. I know that too, she said. I just needed to figure out how. He left. She sat at the corner table with her tea and her notebook, and 71 hours and 40 minutes remaining, and she opened to a fresh page and began working through the full reduction, all 4 movements written for 8 musicians from memory, because the music was entirely and completely in her. She wrote until the coffee shop closed. She walked home through the October night. She let herself into the apartment quietly. Sebastian was in the studio. She could hear the piano, soft and irregular, the sound of someone thinking at a keyboard rather than playing. She went to the practice room. She closed the door. She worked until 4 a.m. She slept 3 hours. When she woke, it was Wednesday. 48 hours until the Lincoln Center premiere, 29 hours until the performance at the Loft. She made coffee. She sat at the desk. She opened the score. She began. The score of Meridian existed in 2 forms. The first was the orchestral score, 62 parts printed and bound, distributed to the musicians of the Chicago Symphony 3 weeks before the Lincoln Center premiere. Iris had overseen the printing. She had proofread every part. This score had Sebastian's name on the title page and the typeface that Lincoln Center used for commissioned works. Meridian Sebastian Crane World Premiere. The second was the original, her laptop. The score software she had been using for 15 years. The file named Meridian _ working _ ifc.sibifc, being her initials. A habit she'd had since graduate school, initials on working files, so she knew which version was hers in a collaboration. Except this was not a collaboration. The initials were just hers. The file had a creation date of January 14th, 9 months ago. It had 847 saves across 9 months of work. It had no version before the January 14th creation because she had started from a blank page on January 14th in the practice room on a morning when Sebastian was in Prague and the apartment was very quiet. She understood been keeping the record without knowing she was keeping it. The save history was not something she had thought about protecting. She had simply been working, saving as she went. The way you saved when you worked digitally, instinctively, because losing work was the only catastrophe in composition that you couldn't recover from. 847 saves. A file named with her initials. A creation date that preceded the premiere by 9 months. She would not need to prove anything in court. She was not planning to sue Sebastian. She was not planning to dispute the Lincoln Center premiere in any legal sense. What she was planning was both simpler and more complete. She was going to perform the music first under her own name so that the public record of Meridian's first performance was not Sebastian Crane with the Chicago Symphony at Lincoln Center, but Iris Calloway with 8 musicians at a Brooklyn venue the night before. First performance. Composer's name. Her name. That was the record she was building. Sebastian left for Lincoln Center at 9 a.m. for a production meeting. Iris sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and watched him go, the particular morning efficiency of a man who had his day organized, who knew where he was going and why, who had the focused ease of someone 48 hours from the culmination of what he believed was his best work. He kissed her on the cheek before he left. "Long day," he said. "I'll be late." "I know," she said. After he left, she sat very still for a moment. Then she got up and went to the practice room and locked the door. She had a lock on the practice room, had always had one, the specific privacy of a space where she could work without interruption, and she sat at the desk and opened her laptop. She spent the morning transcribing the chamber reduction from her notebook into the score software, working with the focused speed of someone who had been doing this for 20 years. The reduction was good. She had known it was good when she wrote it in the coffee shop, had felt the satisfaction of a structural problem solved. Converting 8 musicians' worth of parts from 62 musicians' worth required not just deletion but reinvention. Finding the essence of each moment, redistributing the musical weight so that the chamber version was not a diminishment of the orchestral score but a different experience of the same architecture. She finished the transcription at noon. She printed 8 copies of the parts at the FedEx on Amsterdam Avenue, which she did in 3 trips with her backpack because a single large printing order felt irrationally more visible. She texted the 8 musicians with the rehearsal address and time. She texted the loft's production manager about the setup requirements, a Steinway if available, or an upright if not, specific microphone placement for the string quartet, a music stand arrangement she specified precisely. The production manager was a young woman named Keiko, who had worked with Iris at the solo recital 3 years ago, and who responded with the quick professional efficiency of someone who trusted the person making the requests. At 2 p.m., she ate a sandwich at the kitchen table and looked at the practice room door and thought about what was inside it. The notebooks, the folders, the score history. And she thought, this is the day before the last day of one version of my life. She was not frightened. She examined this carefully because she had expected to be frightened, and found that what she actually felt was the specific clarity that came from having made a decision that could not be unmade. The fear had been in the days before the decision. Once the decision was made, fear had nothing to grip. She had 8 musicians. She had a venue. She had 27 hours. She finished the sandwich. She went back to the practice room. She practiced for 5 hours straight the violin solo in the 4th movement, again and again and again. Not because she didn't know it, but because knowing it and performing it were different. And the performance needed to be perfect, not because a performance critic would be there, Daniel Marsh would be there. But perfection for a critic's ears was not the point, but because the music deserved it. Because she had written it, and it deserved to be played exactly right by her hands under her name. She played the solo until she couldn't feel her fingers. Then she rested for 20 minutes, made tea, and played it again. When Sebastian came home at 9 p.m., she was in the kitchen making dinner as though it were an ordinary evening, which it was not, and which she understood it would never be again. "How was the production meeting?" she said. "Long," he said. He sat at the kitchen table. "The lighting designer has ideas about the final movement. I want the stage dark, just the violin solo in a single spot." "That's right," she said. "That's exactly right." He looked at her. "You think so?" "The 4th movement needs that quality of isolation before resolution," she said. "The single spot is correct." He nodded, pleased, writing something in his notebook. "You always understand the architecture." "I know the piece well," she said. She set a plate in front of him. She sat across the table. They ate, and he talked about the production details, and she listened and occasionally said something that was useful and that he wrote down, and the dinner had the surface quality of every dinner they had shared in 12 years. Underneath it, she was counting hours. 26 hours until the loft. 48 hours until Lincoln Center. She cleared the plates. She washed up. She said she was tired and was going to bed early. She went to the practice room instead. She worked until 2 a.m., 23 hours. Mud. There is a particular quality to working through the night on something that is entirely your own. Iris had experienced it before. Not often, because the nights she had spent working in this practice room over 12 years had mostly been working on someone else's music, absorbing the structure of scores Sebastian was preparing, learning parts he needed her to know, filling in the organizational and musical support infrastructure that had become the invisible architecture of his career. But occasionally in the spaces between those duties, she had worked on things that were hers. Tonight was the largest of those spaces. Tonight was the sum of all of them. She worked through the violin solo until she no longer needed to think about it, until it lived below thought in the physical memory of her hands, which was where music had to live to be performed truthfully. She worked through the transitions between the movements where the chamber version required the most careful handling, because the absence of 62 musicians had to be present as an absence, not as a gap. She worked through the 3rd movement's rhythmic complexity, visualizing Sophia's percussion against James's cello, against her own line, hearing it in her head with the 3-dimensional specificity that came from 20 years of musical practice. At 2 a.m., she set down her violin. She stood at the window of the practice room and looked at the back of the other building, the unremarkable view she had looked at for 12 years, and she thought about the notebook she'd been composing in when she wrote the violin solo. January, February, March, the months when Sebastian was away most. She had been in this room, at this desk, at this window, and the music had come out of her the way music came out of you when you had been practicing long enough as a form of thinking, as the natural extension of everything you already knew in a language that was yours before you knew it was a language. She had composed Meridian in this room. Tomorrow night, she would perform it, under her own name. She went to bed at 2:15 and set her alarm for 6. 3 hours and 45 minutes. Enough. She thought she would not sleep. She was wrong. She slept immediately and completely, the sleep of a person who has made a decision and has nothing left to deliberate. In the morning, there was work to do. She was ready. 20 hours before the loft, Iris was at Lincoln Center. Not for the rehearsal that was at 2, and she would attend because absence would be noticed, but for the 11 o'clock interview with the Times, which Sebastian had agreed to and which she had scheduled, and which it turned out the Times had expanded from a 15-minute piece about the premiere to a 30-minute conversation about Sebastian's creative process. She sat in a chair to the side of the lobby meeting room, slightly out of frame of the photographer's setup, with her notebook in her lap. The interviewer was a culture writer named Anna Strauss, who had covered classical music for the Times for a decade and who asked as good interviewers did questions that she had clearly spent time preparing. The fourth movement, Anna Strauss said. The violin solo. Several musicians I've spoken with have said it feels different from your earlier work, more interior, more personal. Can you talk about where that came from? Sebastian leaned forward slightly. He had good interview posture, attentive without being performative, the ease of a man who had been doing press interviews since his early 30s. It came from a specific question I was working with, he said. The idea of solitude as a form of connection rather than its opposite. The solo violin is alone on the stage, but in conversation with the memory of the full orchestra, everything you've heard is still present. The loneliness is full. Iris looked at her notebook. She had written those words, the loneliness is full, in her compositional notes in February, in the context of explaining to herself what she was trying to achieve with the fourth movement. She had written them as a description, not as a marketable phrase. They had apparently become a marketable phrase. Anna Strauss wrote something. That's a beautiful formulation. Is that a concept you arrived at intellectually, or did it emerge from the composing itself? Sebastian smiled. Both, I think. The composing always teaches you what you're doing. Iris wrote a word in her notebook. Yes. She had arrived at the concept through the composing. She had been composing in this practice room for 9 months. She closed the notebook. She looked at her watch. 19 hours and 40 minutes. The dress rehearsal ran from 2 to 5:30. Iris sat in the 4th row, this time 1 row back, which was not significant, but which felt significant in the way that small adjustments feel significant when everything is in motion. The orchestra was good. They had found the third movement. The entry at bar 47 was exactly right. The displacement present and earned the resolution when it came carrying the weight she had written into it. The fourth movement was transcendent in the way that was only possible with a full orchestra. 62 musicians holding a sustained note while a single violin sang above them, and the single violin was the Chicago Symphony's concertmaster, a woman named Philippa Chen, who played with a clarity and warmth that Iris respected. She listened to Philippa play her solo and felt two things simultaneously: pride and the specific sadness of hearing something you created performed by someone who didn't know they were inhabiting your interior life. Philippa didn't know. None of the musicians knew. The scores they were playing had Sebastian's name on the title page, and that was the only name they had been given. After tomorrow night, the record would be different. Sebastian stopped the rehearsal at bar 93 of the fourth movement, a detail about balance, the strings slightly too present under the violin line. He was right about the balance. She had marked the same spot in her own score 3 months ago with a pencil note: solo should float, not compete. She watched him correct it. She watched the musicians adjust. She watched the music become, through the rehearsal process, closer to what she had intended it to be. And she thought, not for the first time, about the strange intimacy of that. He was conducting her music toward her own vision of it. He was good at that. His gifts were real. They were simply not the gifts he claimed. She left at 5:45. She had to be at the rehearsal space by 6. The rehearsal space was a studio on West 57th Street that she had used before for chamber coaching, a room with good acoustics, a Yamaha upright, and mirrors on one wall that she had always found useful for watching herself play. She arrived first and set up 8 stands with the parts she had printed that morning. They arrived in ones and twos over the following 15 minutes. James with his cello case, Maya with her viola Peter, and Celia with their violins. Sophia with a percussion kit she'd assembled from her own equipment. Marcus Webb with his oboe, and a second cellist named Yuki Nakamura, whom she had added that morning when she realized the reduction needed a second cello line, and whom she had reached by text at 9 a.m. 8 musicians. One room, 19 hours. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them. They were seated instruments out parts on their stands, looking back at her with a combination of curiosity and the particular attentiveness of musicians who had agreed to something without fully understanding it, and were now in the room where the understanding would happen. "I want to tell you what we're doing," she said. She told them. She told them about Meridian. Not the program notes version, but the real version. 9 months of composition in the practice room on West 82nd Street. The score files dated from January, the 847 saves the notebooks on the shelves. She told them about the program notes she had found on Sebastian's laptop on Tuesday morning. She told them about the loft and the performance at 11 p.m. tomorrow, and Daniel Marsh's recorder, and what she intended the performance to establish in the public record. The room was very quiet when she finished. Celia Burke said softly, "I knew." Iris looked at her. "Not this specifically," Celia said, "but I knew. The reading sessions, the way you talked about it. Sebastian never talked about it the way you did." "Does everyone understand what they're agreeing to?" Iris said. "This is going to be a public event. Daniel Marsh is going to write about it. There will be questions from Lincoln Center, from Sebastian, possibly from the press. I'm not asking you to take any position beyond being present at a performance of music I have composed." Silence. James Ford said, "Let's run the first movement." Sophia Reeves said, "I've been looking at these parts. The third movement, percussion, it's extraordinary." Marcus Webb said, "Can we talk about the oboe transition in the second movement? I want to understand your intention." And then they were working. 8 musicians with the music on their stands, working through a piece that had never been performed outside the composer's head, working with the focused, collaborative intensity that good musicians brought to good new music, the specific energy of people encountering something real for the first time. They rehearsed for 4 hours. By 10 p.m., they had run the piece twice through completely and had addressed every structural question Iris had identified. The third movement worked. Sophia had the rhythmic complexity in her body within 90 minutes, which was what Iris had expected. The complexity was difficult in the way that things were difficult when they were right, rather than when they were wrong. The violin solo in the fourth movement she played 3 times during the rehearsal, each time in silence, the other musicians sitting with their instruments in their laps listening. After the third run-through of the solo, James said very quietly, "This is the best thing I've ever played on." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "I know," she said. She had known when she wrote it. She had known in the way that you know when something is true, not with confidence exactly, but with the specific physical certainty of a thing that has arrived complete. They broke at 10:15. Iris stood at the door as they filed out the way a conductor stood at the stage door, and she thought, "I have never stood at this door before. I have always been the one filing out." Marcus Webb was the last to leave. He paused in the doorway. "Iris," he said, "the program notes. The phrase, 'the loneliness is full.'" "Yes." "Sebastian used it in the Times interview today. I saw the clip." "I know." "That's yours." "Yes," she said. "All of it is mine." She paused. "Tomorrow night, the record will say so." He nodded. He left. She stayed in the studio for 20 minutes after everyone left. She sat in one of the chairs with her violin in her lap and the empty music stands around her and the parts on the stands, and thought about tomorrow. 14 hours. She went home. Sebastian was in the studio. She could see the light under the door. She went to the practice room. She played the violin solo once more alone in the quiet apartment. Then she put her violin away. She went to bed. She slept. Thursday, the day of the loft. She woke at 6:30 to a text from Keiko, the production manager. "Setup going well. Steinway confirmed. Sound check at 8 p.m. She replied, "Yes, thank you." She made coffee. Sebastian was still asleep. He slept late the day of a major performance, which was his rhythm, the way some musicians went very quiet and some went very active in the hours before the stage. She moved through the kitchen quietly. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and the morning light, and 12 hours remaining. She thought about what Sebastian would say when he found out. She had thought about this at intervals over the past 72 hours, in the way you thought about a thing you couldn't prevent assessing its shape without being able to change it. He would find out tonight Daniel Marsh would write something, or a musician would tell a musician, and the word would travel, or Lincoln Center would hear and call him. He would find out in the hours between the performance at the Loft and the premiere at Lincoln Center. She thought about what he would say, and she found that she was not afraid of it. She had been afraid of it in the abstract for years, the confrontation, the conversation, the moment when the arrangement they had never formally discussed was named and contested. But now that it was 12 hours away, it had the quality of a thing already survived. The fear had been in the anticipation. The fact of it was simply what came next. She would perform. She would establish the record. She would let the music exist in the world under her name. And then she would have, for the first time in 12 years, a decision to make about what came after. Not today. Today was the Loft. She finished her coffee. She went to the practice room. She played. Well, Sebastian left for Lincoln Center at 11 for a final technical review. She was in the practice room when he knocked on the door and she opened it, and he was in his good coat, the dark gray one with his score bag over his shoulder. "Back by 6, he said. "I'll need to change before the premiere." "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him deciding whether to say something, the specific micro-expression of a person on the edge of a word. Then he said, "Are you all right?" She looked at him. 15 years. The man she had loved and married and helped, and she understood now in some fundamental way allowed to take from her the thing she had never explicitly offered. "I'm fine," she said. "Go, you have work to do." He nodded. He left. She went back to the practice room. At 3 p.m., she sent the event listing to a private mailing list of music journalists, performers, and industry contacts she had maintained for years, 300 people. The kind of list that existed in every creative field that circulated events and concerts and readings among people who were interested. The listing said, "Chamber Performance Meridian composed and performed by Iris Calloway. The Loft at Atlantic Terminal tonight, 11 p.m. She included the composer credit in bold. She included no other explanation. Within 20 minutes, she had 12 RSVPs. Within an hour, 38. At 4 p.m., she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered. The voice was familiar, a woman she had met at 2 Lincoln Center events, whose name took her a moment, Eleanor Voss, the director of programming at Lincoln Center. "Iris," Eleanor said. "I've seen the event listing." "Yes," Iris said. A pause. "Can you tell me what's happening?" "I'm performing a chamber version of Meridian tonight," Iris said. "A piece I composed. You'll have the full story by tomorrow, I expect." Silence on the line. "The premiere tomorrow, Eleanor said. "Will proceed as scheduled, Iris said. "I have no objection to the Lincoln Center premiere. What I am establishing is the first public performance of the work with the correct composer credit." A pause. "I think you understand the distinction." Another silence, longer. "I think I do," Eleanor Voss said carefully. "Iris, this is going to be, the press is going to—" "I know," Iris said. "I've been thinking about it for 3 days. This is the right thing to do." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Will you call me after the performance? I'd like to understand the full picture before tomorrow." "Yes," Iris said. "After." She hung up. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about Eleanor Voss's careful voice, the specific calculation of a programming director managing a situation that had just become complicated, and she thought Lincoln Center knew something was wrong the moment they heard the piece described as mine. They recognized the distinction because anyone who worked closely with music recognized the distinction. She wondered how many people had recognized it over the years and said nothing because the arrangement was established and disrupting it was costly, and the people most immediately harmed by the arrangement were not the people with institutional power. She put her mug down. She went back to the practice room. She played the violin solo until 5:30. Then she changed. A black dress simple with the specific quality of clothing worn by a performer who wants nothing between the audience and the music. She put her hair up. She put on the small pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's, which she wore for important performances. She had not consciously decided to think of this as an important performance when she put them on. They were simply there when she opened the jewelry box. She took her violin case. She took her score bag. She left the apartment. On the sidewalk, she hailed a cab to Brooklyn. She did not leave a note. The loft at Atlantic Terminal was exactly as she had remembered it. A second-floor space above a restaurant with exposed brick walls and good acoustics, and the Steinway on the stage that Keiko had confirmed. The ceiling was high enough for the sound to breathe. The capacity was 200 with seats in rows and a small standing area at the back. Keiko met her at the door. They did the sound check between 8 and 9:30 positions levels, the specific placement of microphones that Iris had specified. James and Sophia and the others arrived by 9, and they did a run-through of the second movement's most complex passage, and everything was where it should be. At 10 p.m., Iris stood in the small backstage area, really just a hallway with her violin in her hand, and the sounds of the audience assembling beyond the door. She could hear them, the specific sound of a room filling voices and chairs, and the anticipatory energy of people who had come to hear something and weren't quite sure what it was going to be. She had an audience. She did not know how many. Keiko had said somewhere between 120 and 150 based on the RSVPs and the walk-ins they'd been letting in from the street, because word had traveled through the music community in the specific fast way that word traveled when something felt significant. Daniel Marsh was out there. She knew because he had texted her at 9:50. "Here, recorder running, ready when you are." She stood in the hallway with her violin. She thought about bar 47. She thought about the notebook by the bed in January. She thought about 9 months and 847 saves, and the practice room window with the unremarkable view. James appeared in the hallway. He looked at her. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. "One more thing." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small printed card. "Keiko put these on every seat," he said. "I hope that's all right. She did it on her own initiative." She took the card. It was a simple program, white cardstock black type printed at the venue's front desk, apparently in the 20 minutes since sound check. It said, "Meridian, a chamber work, composed by Iris Calloway. World premiere chamber performance, The Loft at Atlantic Terminal, October 2026. She read it twice. Composed by Iris Calloway. Her name on a program. For her music. She had not expected this to be the moment this small piece of white cardstock printed in a venue hallway, not the playbill she had proofread and the rehearsal schedule she had made and the score she had produced, but this specific small thing. She stood in the hallway and felt the full weight of it. James waited. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for Keiko and for James and for all 8 of them and for the 72 hours and for the 12 years before them and for the moment of understanding on Tuesday morning that had made this Thursday evening possible. "Thank you," she said. She put the card in her score bag. She walked out onto the stage. The room went quiet. She looked at the audience, 140 people approximately in the low stage light, a room full of musicians and critics and music-adjacent people who had come on a Thursday night because the listing had said something they hadn't quite understood and wanted to. She looked at Daniel Marsh in the third row. He had his recorder on the arm of his chair and his notebook in his hand, and the specific attention of someone who had been told this mattered and was already, from the quality of the room, understanding that he had not been misled. She looked at the 8 musicians arranged behind her, and to her sides James with his cello, Maya with her viola Celia, and Peter with their violin Sophia. At her percussion, Marcus Webb with his oboe, Yuki with her cello. She raised her violin. She said not into a microphone, just into the room, which was quiet enough for it, "My name is Iris Calloway. I composed this piece. Tonight is the first time it will be performed publicly by these musicians under my name. I hope you'll listen." The room was very still. She looked at James. He nodded. She turned to the music. The first note of Meridian rose into the room, the opening viola line, Maya's instrument. The sound she had written in February, imagining exactly this, a single line unaccompanied beginning the piece, the way a question began a conversation. The music started. Iris closed her eyes for one bar and let it settle into her, and then she opened her eyes and she was in it entirely, completely, with the full presence that the best performances required and that she had been holding in reserve for 12 years. She played. The room listened. The recorder ran. This was the record. This was the beginning of the record. It would not end here. The performance ran 1 hour and 52 minutes, including an intermission of 15 minutes during which no one left. That was the detail Iris noticed from the stage when she walked back on. For the second half, the room was exactly as full as it had been at the beginning. 140 people in a Brooklyn venue on a Thursday night, and not one of them had taken the intermission as an exit opportunity. She understood this viscerally as the specific response that a piece produced when it was working, when the architecture was real and the performers were inside it fully, and the audience was being taken somewhere they wanted to go. The third movement was extraordinary. Sophia's percussion, the asymmetric displacement. The slow resolution had the effect Iris had written it to have. You felt the ground shifting under you, felt the disorientation as structural rather than random, felt the approach of the fourth movement's resolution as something earned rather than given. She heard it from the stage playing her own line and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing functioning exactly as designed. The fourth movement began. The rest of the ensemble fell away, first the oboe, then the percussing, then the second cello, then the violas, then the first cello, until it was only the strings, and then only the two violins, and then only her. Celia held her final note as long as the score instructed, a long-held D that faded into the room's silence, and then there was only Iris. The violin solo. She had written it in January. She had revised it in March. She had played it in her practice room hundreds of times since then. She had played it in the rehearsal space last night 3 times while 8 musicians sat with their instruments in their laps and listened. Now she played it in the loft at Atlantic Terminal in a room of 140 people with Daniel Marsh's recorder running in the 3rd row. She played it better than she had ever played it in the practice room. Not because the audience changed the music was the music, the notes on the page, the intention she had built into the structure, but because the room changed the performance. Because 140 people listening in the specific way that a room listens when it has been taken somewhere by the music creates a presence that the practice room cannot contain. Because the solo was written to be lonely and full simultaneously, and lonely and full required an audience to be completely true. She played. The room was absolutely still. She reached the final bars, the long deceleration, the notes spreading further and further apart. The last note held until the bow finally left the string and the note dissolved into silence. The room held the silence for a moment. Then it came up. Not the polite applause of an audience being professionally appreciative, the other kind, the involuntary kind. The kind that happened when something had reached inside the collective experience of a room and found the thing that all 140 people had in common, which was the specific human need to be told that solitude and connection could be the same thing, that isolation contained its own form of fullness, that the loneliness was not the end of the story. Iris stood on the stage with her bow at her side. She did not bow immediately. She stood and let the applause run because the music deserved it, and because she had spent 12 years standing in the audience while applause ran for her work, and she was going to let herself feel this fully in her body in this room before she moved. Then she bowed. Daniel Marsh was on his feet. So was nearly everyone else. She looked at James, who was standing with his cello, applauding with the bow against his palm, and he was looking at her with the expression she recognized from musicians who had just played something they knew was the real thing. She looked at the room, her music, her name, her night. She bowed again. The applause continued. She let it. After the performance, the room did not clear the way rooms usually cleared. People stayed, musicians and critics, and the others who had come in from the street after seeing the listing, and they stayed with the specific energy of people who understood they had been present at something that would be talked about, something that would require a reckoning. Daniel Marsh found her first. He was a tall man with the kind of face that gave away more than he probably intended the specific transparency of someone who had trained himself to be analytically precise and whose emotional responses occasionally outran the training. He looked when he reached her like a person who had just been told something important and was still processing it. "I need to understand," he said. "I know," she said. They moved to a corner of the room, not private because the room was too full for privacy, but quieter. Keiko appeared with 2 glasses of water, which Iris accepted gratefully. "The score," Daniel said. He had his notebook open. "The creation date you mentioned, January 14th, she said. "The file is on my laptop. The version history has 847 saves across 9 months. The program notes I read in the Times preview were from a draft on Sebastian's laptop that I found by accident on Tuesday. I had not written them." He wrote. He was a fast, precise writer. She watched his pen and thought about all the reviews she had read in music publications, the ones that had mentioned Sebastian Crane's characteristic architectural complexity, and his distinctive treatment of rhythmic tension and the interior emotional depth that defines his mature work. She had read those descriptions and felt the small displacement of recognition. Yes, that's right. That's the effect I was after, without examining why she felt it from the outside. "This has happened before," Daniel said. It was not a question. She looked at him. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you're too calm for this to be the first time you've understood what's been happening." He paused. "I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm trying to understand the story accurately." She thought about James's question in the coffee shop. "Is this the first piece? Yes," she said. "This has happened before." He wrote, "How long?" 12 years, she said. He set down his pen. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite anger, something between the two, the expression of a person processing the full scale of something. "What do you want to happen?" he said. "From tonight, from what you publish." She thought about this. She had thought about it for 3 days in the spaces between everything else. "I want the record to be accurate," she said. "I want Meridian on the public record as my composition with my name as the composer from tonight forward. I want that to be established clearly and publicly before the Lincoln Center premiere tomorrow." She paused. "I'm not asking you to make accusations. I'm asking you to document what happened tonight. The recording. You can use it. Everything from tonight, the performance, what I've just told you, the score history, you can use all of it. I've already spoken with an attorney about what I can document legally. The score file, the version history, the notebooks." She paused. "The notebooks are 12 years of composition, all of it in my handwriting." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "This piece," he said, "Meridian. If what you're saying is accurate, and I believe it is, I want you to know that I believe it. This is one of the most significant new works I've heard in a decade." She looked at him. "I heard it for the first time tonight," he said carefully. "In the sense that matters, under the right name. And I want you to know that the music is extraordinary. Not because it changes anything legally or professionally, just I wanted to say that to you, the composer, directly. The music is extraordinary." She felt something shift in her chest, the specific, unexpected quality of being seen clearly, which was different from being recognized, different from being applauded, which she had also experienced tonight. Being seen clearly required someone who was looking for the truth rather than the performance. "Thank you," she said. "I'll write tonight," he said. "The piece runs online tomorrow morning, before the premiere." "Yes, she said. "That's the timing." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, "Will you be all right?" It was a simple question, the kind that people asked when they had run out of professional language and meant the personal thing. She thought about Sebastian and the apartment on West 82nd Street and the practice room with the unremarkable view and 12 years of notebooks on the shelves. She thought about what tomorrow would require, the conversation that was coming, the decisions that would follow it, the long process of understanding what her life looked like in the aftermath of tonight. "I will be," she said. "Not immediately, but yes." He nodded. He put his recorder in his bag. He shook her hand, a formal gesture slightly incongruous that she found she appreciated. He left. Iris stood in the corner of the loft with her violin case and her score bag and the room emptying slowly around her. James found her. "Time to go," he said. "Almost," she said. She stood for a few more minutes, letting the room empty, letting the evening settle into whatever it was going to be. The Steinway was still on the stage. The music stands were still set up. The programs Keiko's improvised programs white cardstock and black type were on the floor between the chairs where the audience had left them, composed by Iris Calloway. She picked one up from the floor. She put it in her score bag beside the violin solo she had practiced until she couldn't feel her fingers, and then had played tonight perfectly. She walked out into the Brooklyn night with James beside her carrying her violin, and the October air was cold and clear, and the city was doing what it always did, which was continue regardless. "Your phone is going to be interesting tomorrow," James said. "I know," she said. "Are you going to be all right?" She thought about Daniel Marsh asking the same question slightly differently. "I already said it tonight," she said, "what I needed to say. The rest is aftermath." They walked to the subway together. At the stairs, she stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for saying yes before I explained." "You're Iris Calloway," James said simply. "I've known you for 18 years. I was always going to say yes." She went down the stairs. The train came. She rode it back to Manhattan in the late-night quiet of the subway, with her violin case on her lap and the program in her bag, and the evening still in her hands, literally, her bow hand which held the physical memory of the performance, the way a bow hand always did, the specific aliveness of having played something well. She rode uptown. She had a conversation to have. She had a life to renegotiate. She had for the first time a name on a program. That was the beginning. Everything after it was hers to build. Daniel Marsh's piece published at 7:15 a.m. on Friday. She read it in the kitchen of the West 82nd Street apartment, sitting at the table with coffee while Sebastian was still asleep. She had come home at 1:30 a.m., had moved through the apartment. Quietly had gone to the practice room and sat for an hour, not playing, just sitting in the room that had held 12 years of work before going to bed. She had slept 3 hours. The piece was in the arts section of the publication's website titled "She Composed It. He Conducted It." Last night, Iris Calloway played it first. Daniel had done it well. He had done it in the specific way that good criticism did things, precisely with the music at the center, the personal and professional dimensions present but subordinate to the primary question of the work itself. He had described the performance, 140 people in a Brooklyn venue on a Thursday night, and the room did not make a sound for the duration of the violin solo in the fourth movement. He had described the score history Calloway provided this writer with documentation of the composition's development, a score file dated January of this year with 847 version saves over 9 months, a series of notebooks covering the same period, and compositional notes in her hand that correspond precisely to the program note language that appeared in Lincoln Center's premiere materials under Sebastian Crane's name. He had been careful. He had documented rather than alleged. He had described what he had heard and seen and been shown, and he had let the reader draw conclusions that were, he understood, inevitable. The final paragraph. Meridian is an extraordinary piece of music, formally rigorous, emotionally complete, and built with the specific architectural intelligence of a composer who has been thinking in these structures for 20 years. Last night, for the first time, the record of who made it is accurate. What happens next at Lincoln Center tonight, and in the broader reckoning that this morning's events will require, remains to be seen. But the first performance of Meridian happened in Brooklyn, under the name of the person who wrote it. That is now in the record. She read it twice. She set her phone down. She heard Sebastian's alarm go off in the bedroom. He came into the kitchen at 7:45. She was on her second coffee. He was in his robe hair, slightly disordered, the specific early morning quality of a man who slept deeply and woke slowly, a quality she had found endearing once and was now simply observing. He poured coffee. He sat at the table. He picked up his phone. She watched his face. She had thought about this moment, the exact moment of his discovery, many times in the past 72 hours. She had imagined anger, denial, the cold performance of grievance. She had imagined in her more unguarded moments something like relief, the release of a person who has been carrying a secret they did not entirely choose. What she saw was neither. What she saw was a man reading something that was rewriting the understanding he had of his own life in real time at a kitchen table. He read for a long time, then he set his phone down. He looked at the coffee cup. He did not look at her. "I got a call from Lincoln Center," he said. "Last night. Eleanor Voss." "I know. She called me too. She said there was a performance." "Yes," Iris said. He was quiet. "The piece ran to a standing ovation," she said. She was not saying it cruelly, she was stating the fact because the fact was relevant. The music had worked. The performance had worked. The record was now in the world. Sebastian looked at her. His expression was complicated in a way she had not expected. Not simple anger, not simple denial, but the expression of a person who has understood something and is sitting with the discomfort of understanding it. "How long have you been writing?" he said. The question surprised her. It was not the question she had prepared for. "My whole life," she said, "since I was 15. I know you've always but the composing, the formal composing." "Since graduate school," she said. "The notebooks go back 20 years. He looked at the practice room door. She watched him doing the arithmetic, the years, the notebooks, the specific moments he must now be reconstructing with a different understanding. She watched him understand something that she had understood on Tuesday morning in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee. "Meridian," he said. "Is mine," she said, quietly, without drama. "Yes." A silence. "The others," he began. "We don't need to do this today," she said. "The Lincoln Center premiere is tonight. You have an obligation to the musicians, to Lincoln Center, to the audience that will be there. You should fulfill it." She paused. "We will have the rest of our lives to have the conversation we need to have. Tonight is not the time." He looked at her. She could not fully read his expression, there were too many things in it. But underneath the complexity, she could see the thing that was most important. He had not said "you're wrong." He had not disputed the fact. He had asked how long she had been composing, and he had looked at the practice room door, and he had said "the others." He knew. He had always, she suspected, known in some way the way people knew things. They had not named things that lived below the threshold of what they were willing to examine. "I'll be at Lincoln Center at 1, he said. He stood up. He took his coffee. He went to the bedroom. She sat at the kitchen table. Her phone had 47 new messages. She did not look at them. She made a third cup of coffee. She went to the practice room. She sat at the desk with the notebooks on the shelves around her and the unremarkable view through the window and the specific quiet of a room that had held her work for 12 years, and she thought, "This is the last morning I will sit in this room exactly like this." Not because she was leaving, she hadn't decided that yet, but because the room was different now. She was different. The arrangement that had defined the room's purpose, the invisible labor, the accommodated erasure was over. What the room was for now was something she would have to decide. She opened the oldest notebook. 2007. Graduate school. The first compositional sketches, rough and exploratory, the handwriting of a younger version of herself, trying to understand what she was doing. She read through an hour of her own past. Then she closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf. She picked up her violin. She played something new, not Meridian, not any finished piece, but the beginning of whatever came next. Free and exploring and entirely her own, with no one to hear it in the room that had always been hers, even when everything it produced had belonged to someone else. She played for an hour. It was, she thought, the most honest hour of music she had produced in years. The Times published a follow-up at 9 a.m. Not a full piece. A brief news item. 3 paragraphs noting the existence of Daniel Marsh's article and Lincoln Center's response. Eleanor Voss had issued a statement. Lincoln Center takes matters of artistic attribution seriously and is reviewing the information that has come to light. The premiere of Meridian this evening will proceed as scheduled. We are in conversation with all parties. All parties. Iris read that phrase and thought, I am now a party. I was always a party. I am now acknowledged as one. 3 music publications posted pieces by noon. Two were essentially reprints of Daniel's documentation with additional context. The third was a longer reported piece by a writer named Amara Hayes, who had clearly been working the phone since 7 a.m. She had quotes from three people who had been at the loft the previous night describing the performance. She had a quote from James Ford, who had said, "I have played with Iris Calloway for 18 years. I know what she sounds like when she is inside music that is hers. Last night, she was inside all of it." She had a quote somewhat surprisingly from Eleanor Voss. What happened last night in Brooklyn was a significant artistic event regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. The work performed is extraordinary. She read Amara Hayes' piece and felt for the first time in the day something that was not the cold specificity of aftermath, but something warmer, the recognition that the music had been heard, not just attended heard. The people who had been at the loft had carried the experience into the day, and the experience was being described accurately, and the description had her name in it, composed by Iris Calloway. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her agent Mara Chen, who represented her performing career, and with whom she had over 12 years developed the specific relationship of two professionals who understood each other's domain without entirely inhabiting the other's. "I've been reading since 8 a.m., Mara said without preamble. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Iris said. "Tell me what you need." "I need a lawyer who handles musical IP, Iris said. "I need to understand what I can claim and what I can't, and I need to understand it before tonight." "I have someone," Mara said. "She's the best in the field. I'll text you." "And Mara, I need you to know something as my agent." "Tell me." "This is not the first piece," Iris said. "I want you to understand that before you make any calls on my behalf, the scope of what happened is 12 years, not one work." A silence on the line. "I see," Mara said. Her voice was careful and precise, the voice of someone absorbing significant information and deciding how to hold it. "All right, I'll have the attorney call you within the hour. And Iris—" "Yes." "What you did last night, going to Brooklyn, the performance, that was exactly the right thing." Iris looked out the practice room window at the back of the other building. "I know," she said. "I just needed the right moment to do it." At noon, Sebastian called from Lincoln Center. His voice was contained in the way that his voice was contained in professional contexts, the conducting voice stripped of most of its personal register. "The orchestra knows," he said. "Word has traveled." She had expected this. "How are they responding?" "Professionally. They're musicians. They'll play the premiere." A pause. "I've spoken with Lincoln Center's director. They're considering a co-composer credit for the program." She was quiet for a moment. "A co-composer credit," she said. "Yes. Iris Calloway and Sebastian Crane Meridian. They think it's the appropriate response given the current—" "No," she said. A pause. "Iris?" "Sebastian, I composed this piece. I composed it alone in this apartment over 9 months while you were in Prague and Vienna and Tokyo. There is no co-composition to credit." Her voice was even. "I understand that Lincoln Center is trying to find a resolution that minimizes disruption, but a co-composer credit is not accurate, and the only thing I am willing to accept is accuracy." A longer pause. "The premiere," he began. "I told you this morning, you have an obligation to the musicians. Fulfill it. The premiere can proceed. What I am saying is that the program tonight should not say Meridian Sebastian Crane. I'm asking Lincoln Center to correct the attribution. They'll need time to— They have 6 hours," she said. "They have a printer in the building." She hung up. Her hands were not shaking. She examined this and found it was true. She realized, past the fear. She had been past it since Tuesday morning. She had been past it since the moment she knocked the laptop onto the floor and the screen woke and she understood what she was looking at. The fear had been in not knowing. Now she knew. The knowing was simply what it was. She called the attorney Mara had texted her. Her name was Lydia Kaufman, and she had, in 45 minutes on the phone, the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had handled a dozen cases like this and understood both the legal landscape and the human one. Lydia's assessment, the score file, the version history, the notebooks, and the program notes were collectively strong documentation of Iris's compositional authorship. The legal path was available, though complex, but the legal path was not, Lydia said, necessarily the right starting point. The strongest position you have, Lydia said, is the one you've already established public documented first performance with your name on it. The legal route is slower, more expensive, and ultimately less important for a living composer than the public record. The public record is what you control. You've already moved it. Lincoln Center is considering a co-composer credit for tonight, Iris said. Don't accept it, Lydia said. It's legally ambiguous and practically misleading. Hold for solo credit. If they push back, we have documentation. They'll push back. I know, let them. Iris thanked her and ended the call. She looked at the time. 2 p.m., 4 hours until the premiere. She picked up her phone and called Eleanor Voss directly. Eleanor Voss answered on the second ring with the quality of someone who had been expecting the call. Iris, she said. Eleanor, I want to talk about tonight's program. Yes, a breath. We've been in emergency discussions all morning. I want you to know that Lincoln Center takes this very seriously. The documentation Mr. Marsh published is substantial. It is, Iris said, because the situation is substantial. The co-composer credit that was proposed is not acceptable, Iris said. I've been advised by an IP attorney, and I'm advising you directly, a co-composer credit is factually inaccurate for a work I composed without collaboration. I'm asking Lincoln Center to correct the attribution to Iris Calloway, sole composer, before tonight's performance. Silence on the line. A long silence. If we do that, Eleanor said carefully, Sebastian will conduct the premiere of a piece composed by Iris Calloway, Iris said. He is a skilled conductor. He has prepared this piece and these musicians and this performance. That is his contribution, and it's a real one. But the composition is mine. Those are not the same thing. Another silence. Iris. Eleanor's voice had shifted something under the administrative caution, now something that was simply a person speaking. I want to ask you something off the record. Go ahead. How long have you known that this was yours in the sense that you were always the one? I knew Tuesday, Iris said. I had been half knowing for longer. Tuesday was when I knew in the way that couldn't be unlearned. And before Tuesday, the earlier works. Iris was quiet for a moment. She looked at the notebooks on the shelves. Yes, she said, before Tuesday. I see. Eleanor was quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was measured and decisive. I'll need 45 minutes to work through the logistics, the program, insert the announcement from the stage. There will be an announcement from the stage. I want you to know that. We will not pretend nothing happened. Good, Iris said. There's one more thing I want to ask, Eleanor said. The premiere tonight, we will introduce it correctly, but I want to know if you plan to attend. Iris had not thought about this. She thought about it now. The hall, the orchestra, the music she had written performed on a Lincoln Center stage for a full house audience of 1,200 people with her name in the program. Yes, she said. I can arrange a seat in the house, Eleanor said. Or there is a small box stage left that would give you the house, Iris said. I'll sit in the house where the audience is. I'll have a ticket held for you at the box office, Eleanor said, under your name. Thank you. Iris, a pause. I'm sorry, for what it's worth from this institution, I'm sorry that the structure existed that made Tuesday possible. Iris thought about that sentence. The structure that made Tuesday possible. Not Sebastian alone, the structure. The arrangement that publishing and institutions and the specific grammar of classical music careers had allowed to persist. It's worth something, she said. Thank you for saying it. She hung up. She looked at the practice room, at the notebooks, at the view through the window. She picked up her violin. She didn't play the violin solo, she knew the violin solo completely. There was nothing more to find in it through practice. She played something else, an improvisation, free and unstructured, the kind of playing she had done when she was a student before her playing became professional and practiced, and the specific disciplined instrument of a career. She played for 20 minutes. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was exploratory occasionally, odd taking turns that didn't resolve in the expected ways. It was, she thought, exactly what playing felt like, when you were free to not know where you were going. She had spent 12 years knowing exactly where she was going, because the destination was always someone else's career, someone else's concert, someone else's name on the program. She played the improvisation until she felt something release in her chest, the specific release of a thing held for a very long time finally being set down. Then she put her violin away. She went to the bedroom. She put on the dress she wore to premieres, a deep burgundy which she had worn to 4 premieres in 3 years, and had always thought of as a dress for someone else's occasion. Tonight, it was hers. She put on her grandmother's pearl earrings. She called a car. She went to Lincoln Center. The program insert was printed on cream paper, smaller than the main program tucked inside the front cover. It read, "Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts wishes to make a correction to tonight's program materials." Meridian was composed by Iris Calloway. The work was given its world premiere chamber performance on October 15, 2026 at The Loft at Atlantic Terminal in Brooklyn, New York, performed by a chamber ensemble under Ms. Calloway's direction. Tonight's performance by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, under the direction of Sebastian Crane, represents the orchestral premiere of the work. We regret the error in the original program attribution and are grateful to Ms. Calloway for bringing this matter to our attention. Iris read it standing in the lobby before the doors opened. She read it twice. Composed by Iris Calloway. In print. In Lincoln Center's name. In the program of the orchestral premiere. The lobby was filling around her, the audience arriving for the premiere. The specific mixture of music lovers and industry professionals and critics and donors that filled a Lincoln Center hall on a significant evening. Several people recognized her in the way that music communities recognized each other. The professional recognition of a known performer. And several looked at her with an additional quality that she understood was the recognition of the morning's news. She found her seat. Third row orchestra center. Eleanor had done her well. The lights dimmed. Sebastian walked to the podium. He looked from the house, as he always looked from the house, composed, authoritative, present. He turned to acknowledge the audience. His eyes moved through the hall with the scan of an experienced conductor reading the room. They found her. A moment, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, in which they looked at each other across the orchestra. She could not read his expression from the third row. She did not need to. The morning had said what needed to be said. He turned to the orchestra. He raised his baton. The first movement of Meridian began. She closed her eyes for the opening bars, the solo viola. The question that began the piece, and when she opened them, she was fully present in her seat in the hall in the specific experience of hearing her music performed by 62 musicians in a Lincoln Center concert hall, which was something she had written toward without knowing she was writing toward it. Something she had imagined in the practice room on West 82nd Street on mornings in February, when the apartment was quiet and the only sound was her pencil and the music in her head. The second movement moved through its long arching lines. The third movement's displacement arrived and resolved. The fourth movement began. The orchestra fell away one section at a time until there was only the string section, and then only the first violins, and then only Philippa Chen's single violin, and the hall was absolutely still. Iris sat in the third row and listened to Philippa play the solo she had written in January, and she felt finally completely in the full presence of 60 feet between her and the stage in the full house of Lincoln Center on a Friday evening what the music was. It was hers. It had always been hers. Now the world knew it. Philippa held the final note. The bow left the string. The note dissolved. The hall held the silence for 2 seconds. Then 1,200 people came to their feet. After the standing ovation, which ran 4 minutes, the kind of applause that was also a statement, Iris stayed in her seat while the hall emptied around her. She was not avoiding anyone. She simply needed the room for a moment. The specific experience of hearing your own music for the first time in a concert hall with 1,200 people required a kind of processing that couldn't happen in motion. The hall emptied slowly. The musicians filed off stage. Sebastian took 3 curtain calls. Each time he appeared, the applause renewed, not diminished, which told her that the audience either didn't know or had decided that the music was the thing, which was, she believed, the correct position. The music was the thing. It had always been the thing. A woman appeared beside her seat, a Lincoln Center staff member, gentle and professional. "Ms. Calloway, Mr. Crane is in the green room if you'd like to, or not, of course, if you prefer to." "Not tonight," Iris said. Please tell him I'll be in touch. The staff member nodded and withdrew. Iris sat for another 5 minutes in the emptying hall. She looked at the stage, the orchestra chairs empty. Now the music stands bearing the parts she had proofread, the Steinway at stage left, where the conductor's piano was positioned for reference. Then she stood. She gathered her coat and her bag. She walked up the aisle and through the lobby and out into the October night. Columbus Avenue was busy with the after-performance crowd concertgoers, moving toward restaurants and cabs, and the subway, the specific animated energy of people who have heard something significant and want to talk about it. She moved through them and found a quiet stretch of sidewalk and stood with the cold air on her face. Her phone was full of messages. She did not look at it. She called Mara Chen. "I was in the house," Mara said immediately. Iris paused. "I didn't know I bought a ticket this afternoon when Eleanor called me about the program insert." A pause. "Iris? The piece." "I know. I have been your agent for 9 years, and I have attended, I don't know, 60 performances you've been part of. I did not know you were a composer." "I know," Iris said. "This is your fault," Mara said in a tone that was not accusatory but was very clear. "You should have told me." "I know that too." A silence. Then Mara said, "We're going to have a lot of conversations in the coming weeks about the catalog, about what you want going forward, about what's possible. But tonight, I just want to ask you one thing." "Go ahead." "Are there other pieces that are finished and can be performed?" Iris thought about the notebooks. 20 years of notebooks. The finished pieces that had been performed under Sebastian's name. The sketches that had become his projects. The fully formed works that lived on her shelves under her initials. "Yes, she said. "How many?" She thought about it carefully. 11 finished works. Various sizes, 3 orchestral pieces, 2 string quartets, a piano concerto, several chamber pieces. A very long silence. "Iris," Mara said finally. "I know," Iris said. "We have a great deal of work to do." "Yes," Iris said. "We do." She stood on Columbus Avenue for a moment longer. Then she hailed a cab. Not to the apartment. She wasn't ready for the apartment yet. She gave the driver an address in Brooklyn. James Ford answered his door in 30 seconds, which meant he'd been watching his phone. "Come in," he said. "I have wine." She came in. She sat at his kitchen table. He poured wine and put bread and cheese on the table and sat across from her, and they stayed in the specific companionable quiet of 2 people who knew each other well enough to know that talking would come after. After a while, James said, "How are you?" "Ask me in a week," she said. "Fair." He broke off a piece of bread. "The hall tonight. I heard it," she said. "From the 3rd row. What was it like?" She thought about it. "Like being a reader at the premiere of your own first book," she said. "In the audience. Not at the podium. But the record now says composed by Iris Calloway." She picked up her wine glass. "That's the beginning. What's the rest?" She thought about Mara's question. "Are there other pieces?" She thought about 11 finished works on the shelves of her practice room. She thought about the pianist who had invited her to open for him at the Loft 3 years ago, who had said afterward that her playing had extraordinary compositional intelligence. "You play like someone who writes," he had said, which she had understood even then as more accurate than he knew. "The rest," she said, "is everything I've been writing for 20 years given back to me." She paused. "It's going to take a while." James lifted his glass. "I have time." "You'll need to," she said. They sat in his Brooklyn kitchen until midnight. The wine was good. The bread was good. Outside, the October city moved through its late hours, indifferent and necessary, the specific backdrop against which lives were rebuilt one evening at a time. She went home at midnight. She let herself into the apartment. Sebastian's coat was on the hook by the door. He was home somewhere in the apartment, in the studio or the bedroom. She did not seek him out. She went to the practice room. She locked the door. She sat at the desk. She opened a new notebook, the first page blank, the pen waiting. She began to write. Not a piece for someone else. Not an arrangement, not an orchestration, not the compositional infrastructure of another person's concert. A new piece. Hers from the first note. She wrote until 2 a.m. Tomorrow there would be lawyers and conversations, and the long, careful work of figuring out what 12 years of invisible work meant legally and professionally and personally. Tomorrow, there would be the question of the apartment and the marriage, and what came after a Tuesday morning that had rewritten the understanding of everything that preceded it. But tonight there was a blank page and a pen and the beginning of something that she would sign with her full name when it was finished. Iris Calloway. She wrote, 6 months after the loft. Iris Calloway had a new apartment in Brooklyn Heights, a legal settlement with Sebastian's attorneys that Lydia Kaufman described as complete as these things get, and a commission from the Chicago Symphony for a new orchestral work. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brownstone on a quiet street with good morning light from the east, in a room she had designated her studio. From the first day. Not a practice room. This time. Not a second bedroom that had been converted, but a room she had chosen for its dimensions and its light and its distance from the street noise. A room that existed for the specific purpose of the work she was doing. She had painted the walls a pale blue-gray that she had been choosing for years in other people's spaces and finally got to choose for herself. The studio had one desk, one music stand, one window, and shelves along 2 walls. On the shelves, 20 years of notebooks. She had taken them from the West 82nd Street apartment in 2 trips in November, carrying them in the rolling suitcase she used for touring, and the scores of 3-string quartets she was in the process of preparing for publication. The string quartets had been performed over the past 12 years as Sebastian's works. The first had premiered at the Ravinia Festival in 2018. The second at the Aspen Music Festival in 2020. The third, the most complex, which she had written over 18 months, had been performed by the Brentano Quartet at Carnegie Hall in 2023, where it had received a review in the Times that called it Crane's most rigorously constructed chamber work. She had read that review in the green room of Carnegie Hall with the specific displaced sensation of someone reading an accurate description of their work attributed to another name. Mara had been working for 6 months on the question of attribution for the existing catalog. The situation was legally complex and humanly difficult, and Lydia had been clear some of it was recoverable, some of it was not, and the distinction depended on factors specific to each work, each performance agreement, each contract. What was recoverable, Lydia had argued with the specificity of someone who had the documentation to back it up, was being recovered. What was not would remain in the public record with inaccurate attribution, which was a reality Iris had accepted without accepting that it was acceptable. The reality of the recoverable, the string quartets. The solo piano work that had been performed twice at Lincoln Center under Sebastian's name and for which the composition history sketches, drafts, complete score files, was entirely documented in her files. The orchestral suite performed by the Houston Symphony in 2021. 4 of the 11 finished works would be republished and re-recorded with correct attribution. It was not all. It was something. 4 names in the record corrected was how she thought about it. Not enough. A beginning. In March, 5 months after The Loft, she had her first public interview as a composer, not as Iris Calloway, the violinist. Not as Iris Calloway, Sebastian Crane's wife, but as Iris Calloway, the person who had written Meridian and 11 other works, and was still writing. The interviewer was Daniel Marsh. They had stayed in occasional contact since October professional contact. A few emails, one brief conversation at a music event where they had both been present and had spoken for 10 minutes about a piece being performed that evening, which was the kind of conversation that felt afterward like more than its surface. He had asked the interview. She had said yes without hesitation because he had been in the room at the Loft and had written about what he heard accurately, and accurate witnesses were not something she was inclined to overlook. They met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn. She had moved to Brooklyn. She realized when she chose the venue, and the coffee shop was 2 blocks from her apartment, and she was apparently a person who lived in Brooklyn now, which felt correct in a way she hadn't expected. Daniel arrived first and was reading something on his phone. When she came in, she noticed this because readers were always reading something which was something she found she liked about him. He stood when he saw her, which was either formal or natural depending on how you read it. They ordered coffee. They sat. He asked good questions. He had prepared carefully. She could tell from the specificity of the questions, the way they built on each other, the moments when he paused and genuinely listened rather than waiting for his turn to ask the next thing. He asked about the compositional process, how she worked, what a blank page felt like after 20 years of practice, whether the chamber reduction for the loft performance had changed her relationship to Meridian or clarified it. She answered each question with the precision she brought to all honest conversations, directly, without embellishment, without the performed humility that she had spent years deploying in professional contexts to avoid taking up too much space. The chamber version was clarifying, she said. When you reduce a piece to 8 instruments, you find out what it's actually made of. The orchestra gives you places to hide texturally, structurally. The chamber version has nowhere to hide. What I found was that the piece had nothing to hide. That was satisfying in the specific way that discovering something you suspected turns out to be true. He wrote something. You said the piece had nothing to hide. You weren't hiding in the sense of the arrangement with your husband. I was accommodating, she said. There's a difference, and the difference matters. Hiding implies deliberate deception. What I was doing was a kind of willful accommodation of an arrangement that I hadn't fully examined. I had examined it enough to know something was wrong, and not enough to name what it was. She paused. Tuesday morning was when I examined it enough. What changed on Tuesday morning? You found the program notes, but the situation you're describing had been developing for 12 years. She thought about this. The program notes were a specific concrete thing, not we work together or I contribute to his work, both of which are framings I had been using for years, framings that were technically accurate but functionally dishonest. The program notes were a document with his name on my words. That's a specific kind of evidence that didn't allow for ambiguous interpretation. He nodded. The line, "The loneliness is full," you mentioned, that appeared in his Times interview. Yes. What does it mean to you, that specific phrase, now, 6 months later? She looked at her coffee. She thought about the notebook by the bed, January, the sentence that had arrived complete in the way that the best sentences arrived, not written so much as received. She thought about reading it in Sebastian's interview, in the program notes, recognizing it the way you recognized a voice. It means exactly what it says, she said. The fourth movement is about being alone with your own work, which has a particular quality. It's full, not empty. The fullness is the work. That's what the solo violin is. She paused. I think it also describes the last 12 years. I was alone with work that filled me. The aloneness was the cost of the arrangement. The fullness was the composition. Daniel wrote for a long moment. Are you still, he said carefully, in the sense of the loneliness being full? She looked at him. It was a real question, not a journalist's question, a person's question. Les, she said, the Brooklyn apartment is better than the practice room on West 82nd Street. The work is the same, but it's... She paused, looking for the precise word audible. Now the work is audible. He nodded. He closed his notebook. Last question, he said. The commission from Chicago. New orchestral work. What are you writing? Something different from Meridian, she said. Meridian was interior, a single consciousness working through isolation toward connection. The new piece is exterior. It's about two voices in conversation, the relationship between them. She paused. I've been thinking about what a real conversation sounds like in music. The give and take. The moments where one voice changes because of what the other one said. She paused again. I've been in a lot of conversations lately that felt like that. Real ones. He looked at her for a moment. That sounds like it's going to be extraordinary, he said. I think it might be, she said. She picked up her coffee. We'll see. After the interview, they stood outside the coffee shop in the March air, the kind of March day that New York occasionally produced, genuinely mild with the first real warmth after winter, the city deciding to try spring for an afternoon. Can I ask you something off the record? He said. Yes. How are you? Not for the interview, just actually. She had been asked this question by several people in the past 6 months. She had developed, she realized, a range of answers corresponding to the specific relationship she had with the asker. For her sister, who had arrived from Philadelphia in October and stayed for 2 weeks, The answer had been long and sometimes tearful and ultimately stabilizing. For Mara, the answer was professional adjacent. Better. Thank you. Let's talk about the quartet recordings. For James, who had become the person she called when she needed to think out loud, the answer was ongoing and never quite finished. For Daniel Marsh, who had been at the loft and had written about what he heard, and who had just spent 90 minutes asking her questions that assumed she had something worth saying, she chose the honest version. Better than I expected to be at this point, she said. The apartment is good. The studio is right. The new piece is, I've been working on it for 6 weeks, and I think it's going to be the best thing I've written, which is strange, because I would have expected this period to be hard for the work. But it isn't. The work is the clearest it's ever been. Why do you think that is? She considered. Because there's no performance required, she said. No managing of how it will be received or attributed or discussed. I'm just writing. The way I used to write when I was very young before I understood that writing had professional stakes. She paused. Meridian was written in a practice room with the door closed in secret, essentially. The new piece is being written in my studio with my name on the notebook for a commission in my name. The difference in the air is... She paused. It's significant. He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. The March light was doing what March light did in New York, when it was warm, making everything look briefly like the better version of itself. I'm glad, he said, that the work is clear. So am I, she said. A pause that had a specific quality to it, the quality of a conversation that had more to say and was deciding whether to say it. The new piece, he said. 2 voices in conversation, the give and take. Yes. I'd like to hear it when it's finished. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the specific directness of someone who has spent 6 months thinking about a thing and has decided to say it. I'll let you know, she said. He smiled, the real one, not the professional one. They said goodbye on the sidewalk. She walked the 2 blocks to her apartment in the March afternoon. She let herself in and went to the studio and opened the score to the new piece, page 27 of what would eventually be, she believed, something significant, and she sat at the desk, and the March light came through the east window, and she picked up her pen. 2 voices in conversation. She wrote the second voice's response to something the first voice had said 3 pages earlier. It was good. It was the right thing for the second voice to say. She kept writing. Chut. The first string quartet, which had premiered at the Ravinia Festival in 2018 under Sebastian's name and was now being republished under hers, had its first official performance as an Iris Calloway work in April, 6 months after the Loft at a chamber concert at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. The Brentano Quartet, who had originally performed the Carnegie Hall premiere of the 3rd quartet under Sebastian's name, and who had been, when Mara contacted them about the attribution correction, immediate and uncomplicated in their response, we would be honored to perform these works correctly. Played the 1st quartet in a program that also included Beethoven and Ravel. The program listed String Quartet No. 1, Iris Calloway, world premiere performance under correct attribution. First performed at Ravinia Festival, 2018, under prior attribution. The parenthetical was Lydia's language, which was precise and unambiguous and carried in its 18 words the entire weight of what had happened. Iris sat in the 4th row. The quartet opened with her first movement, the long unison line that she had written in 2016 in a shared apartment in the Flatiron district before they had moved to West 82nd Street on a morning when Sebastian was at a recording session and she had the apartment to herself. She had written the line in 90 minutes in the specific condition of total absorption that was the best state for writing, the state in which you forgot you were writing and became simply the thing being written. She sat in the 4th row of the Brooklyn Academy of Music and heard that line played by 4 musicians, and the program in her hand said her name, and she felt finally and completely the thing she had been working toward since Tuesday morning 6 months ago. Not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter and more structural, the specific satisfaction of a thing being what it was supposed to be. The 1st quartet was 28 minutes long. When it ended, the audience, smaller than Lincoln Center, more intimate, the specific audience for a chamber program on a Tuesday evening, came up in warm and genuine applause, and Iris stood with everyone else, and then sat back down when they sat. Because she was in the audience, which was where she had chosen to be. The Brentano Quartet looked into the house. Their first violinist, who had been playing Iris's music at Carnegie Hall in 2023, and had said afterward to someone who had passed it on to James, who had passed it on to her, "There is a mind behind this music that I want to know," found her in the fourth row and nodded a small specific acknowledgement. She nodded back. The program continued with Beethoven. She listened. She thought, sitting in the fourth row with the program in her lap, and the studio 2 blocks from the BAM, and 20 years of notebooks on her shelves, and a new piece on page 31, and a commission, and an agent who was building a catalog, and a lawyer who was correcting the record. One work at a time, she was exactly where she needed to be. Not finished. The work was never finished, but exactly where she needed to be. What? The commission from Chicago was due in October 1 year after The Loft. She had 12 months, which was generous by professional standards, and which she used as she used all time, without waste, without performance, with the focused attention that was the only thing she trusted. The new piece had a title by May Dialogue for Orchestra. Not a subtle title. She had been subtle for 12 years, had built her compositional intelligence into works that bore other names, and she had decided that the new piece would not require the audience to look for what it was doing. It was 2 voices in conversation. It was called Dialogue. She worked on it 5 mornings a week from 6 to noon in the Brooklyn Heights studio. The afternoons she kept for the other work, the republication preparations, the conversations with Mara, the occasional teaching she had taken on at a conservatory in Manhattan, where she ran a composition seminar for advanced students. She had not intended to teach. The conservatory had asked, and she had agreed, and she had found that the teaching, the specific act of articulating what she understood about composition to people who were in the middle of learning, it clarified her own work in a way she hadn't expected. She told her students in the first session, "I'm going to ask you to do something that takes practice. I want you to write your name on your score before you write the first note. Not after before. The name comes first. You are writing from who you are not towards some abstract standard. The name is the beginning." They looked at her. "Write your name," she said. They wrote their names. "Good," she said. "Now start." Daniel Marsh attended the Brooklyn Academy concert in April. He was there as a listener, not a critic. He had told her in advance that he wouldn't be reviewing it, that he was coming because he wanted to hear the quartet, and that a review would require professional distance he wasn't sure he could maintain. She had said, "Come as a listener then." They had dinner afterward. Not the first time they had met for coffee, twice since the interview in March, and the coffees had run longer than coffees usually ran, and there had been a conversation about a Shostakovich quartet they had both recently heard that had gone for 90 minutes and felt like 20. She had noticed all of this and had been noting it in the specific way that she noticed things she wanted to think about more carefully before acting on. At dinner after the BAM concert, he said, "The first movement has a quality I've been trying to name since I first heard it." What quality? "It sounds like something remembered rather than invented. Like the composer is writing towards something they already knew, not discovering it for the first time." She looked at him. "That's exactly right. Where does that come from?" The line in the first movement. The opening unison. "I wrote it in 2016. I wrote it in one sitting in 90 minutes in the condition I call total absorption. When I encounter music I've written in that state, it feels remembered rather than made. Because by the time you hear it again years later, you've forgotten the act of writing it. You only remember the thing." "That's a strange relationship to have with your own work," he said. "It's the best relationship," she said. "If you still feel the effort of writing it, it wasn't finished. When it feels remembered, it's done." He thought about this for a moment. "I want to write about that," he said. "That distinction." "Can I write about it?" she said. "It's true." They talked about other things. A recording he had been listening to a composer. She had recently discovered a conversation she'd had with one of her students about voice and identity. They talked until the restaurant closed, which was something she had not done since she was a student herself, when time was plentiful and conversations were the main currency. Walking back toward the subway afterward, he said, "The new piece. You said 2 voices in conversation, the give and take." "Yes." When you described it in the interview, you said you'd been thinking about what real conversations sounded like in music. Yes. Have you found what they sound like? She thought about the score on page 43, where the two voices had their most complex exchange, where the first voice said something the second voice hadn't expected, and the second voice responded not with agreement or disagreement, but with something the conversation had produced in the space between them. She thought about whether she had found it. I think so, she said. Page 43. I'll know for certain when it's finished. He nodded. They had reached the subway entrance. He was going to the east side sheet of Brooklyn. Iris, he said. Yes. He looked at her with the specific attention that she had over 5 months come to understand as his natural mode, the attention of someone who was genuinely trying to understand the thing in front of him rather than the thing he had expected. Page 43, he said. I'd like to hear it, when you're ready to let someone hear it. She looked at him for a moment. The March air actually, April now fully spring, moved past them on the sidewalk. I'll call you, she said. He smiled. She went down to the train. On the subway home, she sat with her score bag on her lap. She always carried the score bag. Now out of habit, the way musicians carried their instruments everywhere, and she thought about page 43 and the two voices and the thing a conversation produced in the space between two people who were genuinely paying attention. She thought she understood what that was musically. She had been writing toward it for 6 weeks. She was getting close. Dialogue for Orchestra was completed in September, 1 month before the commission deadline, which was the first time in her professional life she had finished a major work a month early, which she took as a data point about what happened to her work when she was allowed to do it under her own name without negotiation. She sent it to the Chicago Symphony's programming director on a Tuesday morning. The director responded in 4 hours. We've had it read through by 3 of our principals. They say it's extraordinary. We'd like to schedule the premiere for next season's opening program. She sat at the desk in the Brooklyn Heights studio and read that email and thought this is what it was always supposed to feel like. The opening program. Her piece. Her name. She wrote back, "That's wonderful. Let's talk about the program details." She put her phone down. She opened a new notebook, the one she had been saving for the next piece, which she had been thinking about since July and which she now understood was a string quartet, the 4th. The first she would write without any pretense of collaboration, the first whose notebooks would say Iris Calloway. String Quartet number 4 from the first page. She wrote the composer's name on the cover. She wrote the first note on the first page. She began. Outside the Brooklyn Heights studio, October was doing what October did. Making everything look more itself. The leaves changing the light at that angle, the specific quality of a season that was honest about its own impermanence. She worked through the morning in the good light, and the first movement started the way the best first movement started, with a question she didn't know the answer to yet. She wrote toward the answer. She always wrote toward the answer. That was the work. That was what she had always been for. 1 year after the loft. October again. The specific October quality that she had spent 1 year understanding as her season. Now the season of the beginning. The season she would always associate with a Tuesday morning and a cold cup of coffee and a laptop screen and the decision to stop accommodating what she had been accommodating. She was in the Brooklyn Heights studio with the morning light through the east window and the 4th string quartet on page 12 and a coffee that was still hot, which she considered a success. In 1 hour, she would walk to the subway and take the train to Manhattan and meet Daniel Marsh at a coffee shop on West 72nd Street, 2 blocks from the apartment on West 82nd that she had lived in for 9 years and no longer lived in, and they would have the kind of conversation that she had over the past year come to depend on the way she depended on good coffee and morning light as a condition for thinking clearly. It had not been a formal thing, and then it had been a formal thing the way events in one's life sometimes resolved into clarity without being decided. He had called her about page 43 in July. She had played the passage for him on the phone, holding the violin to the speaker, and he had been quiet for a long moment and then said, "That's what a real conversation sounds like." And she had thought, yes, that is exactly what it sounds like. They had gone to a Brahms concert in August. He had held her hand in the dark of the concert hall, which was either very traditional or exactly right for two people who were primarily made of music, and she had decided it was exactly right. She thought about all of this with a mild satisfaction, the kind of satisfaction that was not uncomplicated but was genuine, the satisfaction of a life that was being built by her own choices, rather than accumulated by accommodation. There was work still to do in the personal sense, the divorce, which had been finalized in June, with the specific bureaucratic indifference of legal endings. The question of the catalog, which Lydia was still working through, the conversations with Mara about the recordings about which works could be reattributed and which were too entangled in existing contracts to touch. 4 corrected, 11 in process, an unknown number of performances over 12 years that would remain in the record with the wrong name. She had accepted this. Not easily, she had been angry at moments in ways that surprised her with their intensity in the private space of the Brooklyn studio at 10 p.m. when the work was done and there was no one to perform composure for. She had been angry with the precision of someone who understood exactly what had been taken and could enumerate it. But anger was not the ending. Anger was the response to the understanding. The understanding was what produced the action. The action was the loft and the record and the 4 corrections and the 11 in progress and dialogue for orchestra on the opening program of the Chicago Symphony's next season. The action was the studio with the pale blue-gray walls and the morning light and the 4th string quartet on page 12. She wrote 2 more pages before she needed to leave. Dialogue for Orchestra premiered at Symphony Center in Chicago in September of the following year, 18 months after The Loft, in the season opening program that the Chicago Symphony's programming director had promised. The hall was full. The program listed the work first before the Beethoven Symphony that followed Dialogue for Orchestra Iris Calloway world premiere. Daniel was in the audience. He had taken a flight from New York. He had not told her he was coming until he was at the gate, which was either thoughtful or slightly maddening, and she had decided it was thoughtful. He sat in the 5th row. She sat beside him. The piece began. 2 voices, the strings and the winds in conversation. Not confrontation, not agreement. The more complex thing, the thing that required 2 separate intelligences genuinely responding to each other, changing in response to what the other had said, arriving together at something neither could have reached alone. She had written it in the Brooklyn studio over 9 months of mornings. She had revised it 4 times. She had played through it at the piano awkwardly. She was not a pianist to check the harmonic logic. She had had 3 conversations with Daniel on the phone about the architecture of the second movement when the structure wasn't doing what she wanted, and those conversations had produced. She thought the solution that the second movement needed, which was one of the more unusual compositional methods she had used, but which worked. The piece ran 43 minutes. When it ended, the audience came up in the way she was beginning to understand as the specific response to dialogue, not the held-breath silence of the Meridian violin solo, but something more active, more social, the response to music that felt like a conversation you wanted to be part of. She stood with everyone else. Daniel put his hand on her arm briefly. Not the concert hall hand-holding, just a touch, the specific gesture of someone wanting to say something they didn't have words for yet. Page 43, he said quietly. She knew which moment he meant. The exchange between the woodwinds and the strings in the second movement's climax, the moment she had been writing toward since July of the previous year, the moment that had required 9 months to reach properly. Yes, she said. That's the real thing, he said. I want you to know I heard it. That's the real thing. She looked at the stage. The conductor was at the podium taking his bow, the Chicago Symphony's music director, a woman named Sarah Park, who had championed the commission from the beginning and who had said after the first rehearsal that the piece was something she intended to program every season. She looked at the stage. Dialogue for Orchestra Iris Calloway. On the program. In the record. Thank you, she said, for hearing it. She meant it in more than one way. He understood more than one meaning. The applause continued. What? After the concert, there was a reception in the hall's foyer, the post-premiere gathering of musicians and supporters and press that was the standard ritual which Iris had attended dozens of times as the wife of a conductor and was attending for the first time as the composer. It was different. The difference was structural. People sought her out. rather than including her in conversations about someone else. They asked her questions about the music that were questions for the composer, about intention, about process, about the specific choices she had made. She answered in the same register she used in teaching directly, precisely, with the assumption that the person asking wanted the real answer. James Ford found her near the end of the reception. He had made the trip she had told him about the premiere months ago, and he had said, without discussion, "I'll be there." He had been at the Loft. He had been at the BAM concert. He was at Symphony Center in Chicago. "I have to ask," he said. "Ask," she said. "Better than Meridian." She thought about it honestly. "Different," she said. Meridian is interior one consciousness working through its own isolation. Dialogue it's what comes after. It's the music of two people genuinely present to each other. She paused. "I think they're both what they are. I think I couldn't have written dialogue without Meridian, and I couldn't have written either of them without—" She stopped. "Without the 12 years, James said." She looked at him. "The 12 years? The practice room with the unremarkable view. The notebooks. The 847 saves. The Tuesday morning. Without understanding what I was she said, which took the 12 years to understand." James raised his glass. "To the 12 years, then, for producing this." She raised hers. "And to what comes next, she said. "What comes next? String quartet. I'm on page 14. She smiled. 4 movements, I think. The first one starts with a question I don't know the answer to yet. "You always write toward the answer, he said. "Always, she agreed. Epilogue. 2 years after the 4th String Quartet premiered at Carnegie Hall in the spring, the Brentano Quartet, who had been asking for a new work since the reattributed performances of the first 3 quartets, performing a piece she had written in the Brooklyn studio over 6 months of mornings that began at 6 and ended at noon, and produced by her count the most technically accomplished and emotionally complete thing she had ever made. The Carnegie Hall program String Quartet No. 4, Iris Calloway World Premiere. She sat in the 5th row with Daniel on one side and James on the other, which was the right configuration, the 2 people who had been present from the beginning who had said yes before the explanation was complete. The Brentano played the first movement, the question she had written in October, the question she had spent 6 months answering. The answer arrived in the 4th movement's final bars. Not a resolution in the conventional sense, but a transformation the kind that required the full preceding architecture to make sense. The question from the first movement returned to, in a different key, in a different register, recognizably the same question and unrecognizably changed by everything that had come between. She listened. She had always listened for 12 years to her own music from a careful distance from the audience of someone else's career, from the practiced remove of a person who had learned not to claim what she had made. Now she sat in the 5th row of Carnegie Hall and listened to her own music with her whole self, with no distance, with the specific presence that the music required and deserved. And she felt the first movement's question and the 4th movement's transformed answer as the shape of the past 2 years, the question being Tuesday morning, the answer being this hall, this program, this name, Iris Calloway. The 4th movement's final bars arrived. The bow left the string, the note held in the hall for one breath. Then Carnegie Hall came up. She did not move for a moment. She sat in the 5th row with the program in her lap while the audience around her stood, and she looked at the stage, the Brentano Quartet taking their bow. The first violinist gesturing toward the house in the direction where the composer was sitting, and she thought about all the things that had led to this specific moment in this specific hall. Then she stood. She stood because the music deserved it, and because the musicians deserved it, and because she was the composer and the composer was who she had always been, and who she was finally permanently publicly allowed to be. She stood, and she clapped until her hands hurt, which was appropriate. Afterward, Daniel said, "How does it feel?" She had been asked this question in various forms since October of 2 years ago. She had different answers depending on the moment, the asker, the specific weight of the occasion. Tonight in the lobby of Carnegie Hall, with the program in her hand and the music still in her body, and the people who mattered most standing beside her, she had one answer, which was also the truest one. "Like the beginning," she said. "Still." He smiled. James on her other side said, "That is the correct answer." "I know it," she said. "It's always going to be the beginning. The beginning is what I do." She put the program in her bag. She picked up her violin case. She had brought it because she always brought it because the violin was the instrument through which she had discovered that she was a composer, and she was not yet done playing. She was not done with any of it. She walked out of Carnegie Hall into the New York spring night with Daniel on one side and James on the other, and the city around her doing its usual impossible thing of continuing to exist and containing everything at once. She had a studio in Brooklyn and a new notebook and a commission that had just arrived that morning for a piano concerto, and she had 12 years of invisible work slowly becoming visible, and she had her name on a program at Carnegie Hall. She had finally and completely and irreversibly herself. That was the whole story. It was still beginning. She walked. She was not done. She would never be done. And that perpetual beginning, that endless work, that name on the score from the first page was exactly, precisely, entirely right. The year following the Carnegie Hall premiere was by any measure the most active of Iris Calloway's professional life. 3 recordings entered production: the first string quartet, the orchestral suite, and Meridian itself, which Mara had arranged with a label that specialized in contemporary classical music and that understood the specific cultural weight of the recording's context. The Meridian recording sessions took place in Chicago with a chamber ensemble she chose herself in a studio that had the specific quality of the room at the loft translated into professional audio, intimate enough for the music to breathe, precise enough for every voice to be individually heard. She was in the control room for every session. The producer, a woman named Eleonora, whose work she had admired for years, asked on the first day whether she wanted the violin solo done in a single take or multiple passes. "One take," Iris said. "If it's not right in one take, I'll know. You'll play it yourself." "Yes." "You're the composer," Eleonora said, "but you're also the violinist. For the recording, is it better to have—" "I'll play it," Iris said. The solo was written by the person who's going to play it. The performance should be the same person. She played it in one take. It was right. Eleonora in the control room afterwards said, "I've been producing recordings for 22 years. That's one of the 6 best takes I've ever been present for." Iris thanked her. She put her violin away. She went to the control room and listened to the playback with her eyes closed, and the music was her music played by her hands under her name, and the recording would be in the world permanently, accurately attributed correctly. Meridian Iris Calloway, composer. Permanently. In the record. Hers by. In December, 14 months after The Loft, the Lincoln Center. Mostly Mozart Festival announced its upcoming season. The announcement was in the Times with a program listing that included string quartets by Iris Calloway, Brentano, String Quartet Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, all 4 quartets. A full evening. She read the announcement at the kitchen table in Brooklyn Heights, with coffee that was still hot, and she thought about the practice room on West 82nd Street and the notebooks on the shelves, and the specific unremarkable view from the window. And she thought, this is what the practice room was for. This is what all of it was for. Not the Lincoln Center listing that was a consequence, not a purpose. The purpose was the music. The purpose had always been the music. The music was the thinking, the understanding, the working through of things that could not be worked through any other way. She had spent 12 years doing that thinking invisibly. She would spend the rest of her life doing it visibly. The distinction was everything. She called her mother the evening the Lincoln Center announcement was published. Her mother, who lived in Philadelphia, who had been a music teacher for 30 years, and who had attended the Loft at the Loft, and had sat in the 3rd row, and had said nothing during the performance, and had said afterward simply, "I knew you were writing. I didn't know how much," answered on the first ring. "The Lincoln Center announcement," her mother said. She had already seen it. "Yes," Iris said. "All 4 quartets. All 4. A pause. Her mother's pauses had a specific quality. They were not empty. They were full of the things she was deciding whether to say. "Iris," her mother said. "Yes." "I want to say something and I want you to listen." "I'm listening." "I'm so angry," her mother said, "on your behalf. I'm so angry at the years. I'm telling you this because I think you should know it. And because I think you've been very measured about the anger, and I want you to know that measured is fine, but anger is also correct. Iris was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said, for saying that. And I'm proud, her mother said, in a way I don't have words for. 4 quartets at Lincoln Center. A recording of Meridian, the commission from Chicago, the Carnegie Hall premiere. A pause. You did all of this. The anger is correct and the pride is correct, and both of them fit in the same space. I know, Iris said. How are you? She looked out the window of the Brooklyn apartment. The December night was clear, and the city lights were doing their usual thing, which was to make the dark look habitable. I'm writing, she said. The piano concerto. I'm on page 28. Is it good? I don't know yet, she said honestly. It's a question I don't have the answer to yet. I'm writing toward the answer. You've always done that, her mother said. Yes, Iris said. I have. They talked for an hour. She talked about the concerto and the recording and the Lincoln Center program and the conservatory students and Daniel, whom her mother had met twice and had described as a person who listens carefully, which is the most important thing. She talked until the December night had deepened and the coffee was cold and the city outside was as quiet as the city got, which was not very. When she hung up, she went to the studio. She opened the piano concerto to page 28. The question she had been writing toward for 6 weeks was on page 28, in the piano's left hand, a low repeated figure that was either the answer, or the beginning of the answer, or the condition for the answer. She didn't know which yet. She wrote page 29. She worked until midnight. She put her pen down. She sat in the studio with the December quiet, and the notebooks on the shelves, and the score on the desk, and the pale blue-gray walls that she had chosen herself, and the east window that would be full of light in 7 hours. She thought, sitting in her studio at midnight with a piano concerto on page 29 and a string quartet in production and a recording and a Lincoln Center season and a commission and a man who listened carefully and a mother who was correctly angry and correctly proud and the full weight of 2 years of becoming visible after 12 years of not. She was, for the first time in the years she could remember, entirely herself. Not performing, not accommodating, not writing invisibly in a practice room with the door closed. Here in her studio with her name on the notebook from the first page. Entirely herself. She picked up the pen. She wrote page 30. She kept writing. She would always keep writing. That was who she was. That was who she had always been, and now finally completely, and with her name in the record, the world knew it.